You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
This is episode 475 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. It's Monday, and so Will Porter's on the show to talk about what he's been writing in the past week over at RT. He covers, everything over there, but really what we focus on are events going on around the world with the U.S. empire. Will has been a staff writer there for almost a year. He has a large writing archive at a site called the Daily Sheeple. He's written articles that have been published on antiwar.com, consortiumnews.com, and the Libertarian Institute, which is, of course, where you find this show and the Daily News Roundup that I write. Will, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me back. How you doing?
All right. Well, it's all right. I guess, maybe talking about a different part of the world than I would have thought this week. We have some stuff to cover first, but I think generally what me and you have covered is the U.S. warfare in the Middle East. And recently, the threat of war on the horizon looked like Iran, but we're going to be talking quite a bit more about Venezuela today. I did want to start off with hoping to get some updates from you on what's going on with the USS Theodore Roosevelt, the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier that has an outbreak of coronavirus and is now in Guam.
Yeah. So we had talked about this last week, the Roosevelt, as you said, this aircraft carrier that's deployed over around the Philippines and Vietnam in the South China Sea. And as I explained last week, there was this coronavirus outbreak on the ship, which, at first was just a couple dozen guys, but now there ended up being, I think, 155 crewmen infected ultimately. And so this ship ended up docking in Guam to have all 4,000 or 5,000 crewmen on board get tests for the virus. But pretty soon after that, after they had pulled off in Guam, they had to divert their whole mission and kind of take this aircraft carrier out of commission, So they it's a pretty big distraction from their mission. But not long after they went to Guam, the commander of this aircraft carrier, Captain Brett Crozier, had sent out this letter directly to the Defense Department. And he sort of skipped over several rungs on his chain of command to do that. And he kind of begged the senior officials to allow for a full evacuation and quarantine of the ship's crew. And for a military communication, it was a pretty serious, dire sounding letter. He had warned that the Roosevelt had to be evacuated immediately to avoid what he called tragic outcomes. And so this was a pretty dramatic letter that he sent. And even though the Defense Secretary, Mark Esper, had said just a few days prior that an evacuation wasn't needed on the ship yet, the Navy ended up granting this guy's request, the captain, at least partially. They allowed a pretty good chunk of the ship's crew to now disembark and go into Guam, into quarantine, where I think a lot of them are going to be put up into hotels. And there's, I think, a rotating crew, a skeleton crew on board the actual ship right now. So it's not fully evacuated, but a good chunk of its personnel are now gone onto Guam. But on this very same day that they granted the request, they also decided to fire the commander, Captain Crozier, because of his letter. And they basically said that he had caused unnecessary alarm with it and that he, broke the chain of command. And he sent the letter over a non-secure email service, which eventually ended up getting leaked to the press. And so now this whole story is kind of blown up. A lot of people are really criticizing the Navy for firing this captain and, just sort of saying he was just trying to save his crewmen. And, of course, plenty of people are placing this now solely on the president and sort of pitting this captain against the president and hailing him as a hero. Some of that stuff might be a little bit, overwrought. But yeah, there's been a pretty strong reaction to this captain's firing. He sent this your audience can go and read the 4-page letter. It's actually pretty interesting, the stuff he was warning of. But this was the biggest outbreak on a Navy vessel so far, a Navy warship, and sort of to see how how it was handled. It seems based on the letter that Crozier sent that maybe the Navy wasn't acting urgently enough. At least that seemed to be his view, that he was insisting that this thing had to be evacuated. There have been a few other Navy warships that have had outbreaks on them, but I think there were 3 of them, and none of those were on deployment. And their outbreaks were nowhere near as big as the Roosevelt's. And as actually you just informed me, this captain actually himself now just tested positive for the virus. being on that ship with all these thousands of people in these close quarters, it's, virtually impossible to like contain people and, do, distancing and stuff. But now it does seem that they're sort of getting this sorted out, this outbreak on this ship, and they're allowing the soldiers to evacuate and to quarantine. And so it seems the outbreak there won't get extremely worse at this point. It can probably only get better after these measures have been taken. But yeah, this whole thing was kind of just an interesting example of like how the Navy might deal with a major outbreak on a ship, and it, maybe not as effectively as they could have.
Yeah, so the first thing I want to point out is that this is something we talked about on the show and kind of said that we thought this would be an issue, that you really can't contain these kind of outbreaks on the ships. And it's part of the reason that waging a global empire is so, kind of costly and dangerous, is that now you have 4,000 Americans on this very large floating runway. And obviously, if there's an outbreak of coronavirus and how fast it spreads and how serious some of the acute lung conditions are, there's not enough equipment on board that ship to treat all these young men and women. And so what are you going to do? You got to either fly in places or let them off the ship. But either way, it's a consequence of the empire. One thing I want to talk about, Will, is I think if you're not somebody who focuses and talks about the U.S. Empire as much as we do and looks at all the nuance and details as much as we do, the most striking part of this story is, I guess, what a kind of villain that Trump and the Navy end up as, where you have this guy who made some really difficult call and sends, this email and, and tries to, get what he needs for his crew and his ship. And that's, I think supposed to be what a captain does, and apparently made some hard choices. And in response to that, he was fired. And then, of course, I think the chanting of the crew of his support is just like, it's like almost a moment from a movie. And I think that's probably why it's powerful and resonates so much, where like that is the hero who is walking off of the ship. And, it's the villains back in Washington, D.C. And so I don't know, like, do you think this has any impact on like how people view the U.S. Military, or am I missing something with the optics there? And why the hell did the Trump administration fire this guy? Because it seems pretty clear to me that like this is a problem with it, is just how terrible this looks for the government.
Yeah, I mean, the visuals for the Navy and the government are definitely not good. Like the public reaction has certainly been one of like, very harsh and critical of the Navy for doing this. But something that you had actually pointed out to me off air was, this might be to send a message within the military. Maybe this is so, just in case, like I said, there have been a couple other outbreaks on ships. And, just in case it happens again and it gets that bad, maybe they're trying to warn, other captains, other commanders that like, hey, don't take this path. Don't make it a public, don't air this grievance in public, because the military actually, just after this captain had sent his letter, they actually decided to stop sharing like detailed data on infections in the military. And so it might be that they're trying to sort of, keep this under wraps if there are severe outbreaks on ships. And they might have, legitimate military reasons for that, to say, they don't want quote unquote adversaries to know, where are weak points, which aircraft carrier is, hit with the virus or something. But nonetheless, I think, this could be a message to other Navy commanders and other captains to say, hey, like if you get an outbreak on your ship, don't take the path that this guy did.
Yeah. And another thing to look at here is that this also has consequences for people in other places. Now that a ship full of 4,000 people with the outbreak of coronavirus has obviously infected, a significant number of the crew. They, I think, had 100 positive tests when they stopped sharing information, and we have since learned the captain tested positive. So that to me suggests that there's probably a lot of people on that ship that are positive. Well, having those people arrive in Guam, an island, as you pointed out to me, that only has 3 hospitals on it. Well, it could strain the medical resources there and lead to an artificially, either larger outbreak by the, U.S. personnel, bringing in the disease, and then whatever nurses from the island or any kind of other staff contract it and then spread it around, either make the outbreak worse or take up more medical resources on the island, leaving less for other people. And, we kind of know that that's what's killing people a lot of times here is there's just not enough ventilators in the area. And so I at least for me, that's a concern.
Yeah, I mean, Guam is such a very small, remote place that I don't imagine it'd be too easy for them to get like serious reinforcements if they need, medical reinforcements, if they need more ventilators, as you said. I know the Navy did say it was going to be sending out like additional medical staff and stuff to support the crew of the Roosevelt. But, so maybe that would help to take some of the pressure that they would put on Guam's healthcare system. I know one of their 3 hospitals is a naval hospital, so like the military does have something to do with that. But yeah, certainly that could also turn into a pretty big like public relations issue if all these sailors are taking up all the resources on this little island.
All right. Well, the reason I want to talk about this, even though I think the Venezuela issue is much more important first, is because as Will's going to describe here, the nature of the operation that the U.S. is now carrying out as an anti-drug or anti-Maduro operation is going to seem heavily rely on the Navy. So understand when Will's talking about this and all the ships that are being deployed, each one of them seems to at least potentially be, USS Theodore Roosevelt crisis in the waiting. So we'll go ahead and explain to people what's going on here, the hawkish actions being taken by the Trump administration against Venezuela. And while some, very astute U.S. foreign policy observers are saying like, hey, wait a minute, we know Trump's warmongering against Iran. But, looking at history of what the U.S. has done in this region of the world, it seems like maybe we're about to have a history repeats itself moment and the U.S. will carry out a military operation in Venezuela.
Right. Yeah. So late last week, the Pentagon announced that they would embark on this new mission. They were going to be sending a bunch of warships into the Caribbean Sea. And they're claiming that they're going to be fighting drug traffickers and cartels. And they actually, I think the defense secretary had even said that the cartels are trying to exploit the pandemic to bring more drugs into the U.S. Of course, citing no evidence there, just saying that like this has become some dire problem now all of a sudden. But they've also signaled, though, that this is going to be targeted at Venezuela and its president, Nicolas Maduro. And the Justice Department, we should remind listeners, just indicted Nicolas Maduro just a couple weeks ago, as well as like a dozen or so other current and former Venezuelan officials for what they called narco-terrorism, which like such a great dramatic term to hit someone with. But they accused Maduro of working with FARC, this Colombian leftist militant group, to try to quote unquote flood the United States with cocaine. And so that's like that's another recent event here that you should keep in mind when we're seeing this military operation go forth, is that we just indicted Nicolas Maduro for narco-terrorism, what they call. And of course, on the same day of that indictment, too, the State Department had put out this $15 million reward for anyone who has information on Maduro. And so to me, that might suggest that they don't have a lot of great evidence for this case here, if they're basically begging the general public for information with millions of dollars. But nonetheless, this new mission, they're going to be sending some Navy destroyers, some literal.
Can I ask a question real quick?
Oh,
Do
sure,
they actually define what makes narco-terrorism like terrorism versus just like a drug trafficker? Because I think it's so important, because if it's just Maduro is trafficking drugs, it's a very, very tough sell, if not an impossible sell, to get the American population to go along with a military intervention there. However, if you add the terrorism part on the end, and then people think, oh my God, Maduro gets away with this, and somehow somebody blows themselves up in Times Square, we have to get involved here. So I'm just wondering if the government provides any details on that, or if it's just propaganda scare tactic.
I tend to think it's the latter. Like I haven't seen any like meaningful legal distinction between regular drug trafficking and narco terrorism. I mean, a lot of drug trafficking organizations are armed, like in Mexico and Colombia and stuff. There are, so I guess all of them you could call, if your only criteria for terrorism is that it's like an armed group or something, then I don't know. But yeah, I don't think they have any, I don't know if there's any legal distinction there. As far as I know, I mean, I think the evidence for Maduro being involved in drug trafficking in the first place is pretty thin, like I'm saying, with the State Department begging for information. But also, I think even less so, I think there's even less information that Maduro is involved in any kind of terrorist attacks. Like I don't know, maybe, somebody could point that out to me. Maybe I've just missed it, but I have not seen any indication that he's involved in terrorism at all. So, yeah, it does seem to me that they're just trying to, sort of, blacken his name, and so that they can justify this military operation they're embarking on. But in this operation, they're sending Navy destroyers, literal combat ships. The Coast Guard is providing some cutter ships. They're sending helicopters, AWACS surveillance planes, and then apparently they're even going to be sending special forces guys to do things like on land. And I don't know what those guys are actually supposed to be doing, but that was mentioned in some of the reporting that they would have some special forces like ground team, like boots on the ground. And I don't know what country they plan on operating in either, because this mission is in the Caribbean Sea. And so I don't know. There's a lot
I did see some U.S. Special Operations Forces deployed to the Venezuelan-Colombian border.
Okay, so yeah, maybe they will be, putting boots on the ground in Venezuela or right in the border there in Colombia. And of course, there's also all kinds of little island nations there in the Caribbean too. So I don't know if they plan on putting guys there. But we should remember, too, that the U.S. has been trying to push Nicolas Maduro out of power for a long time. So this is not just coming out of nowhere. You have this indictment, but you also have quite a long history of them trying to push him out of power. We have, the U.S. has backed an opposition figurehead, Juan Guaido, against him, who declared himself interim president of Venezuela, I think in 2019, and the U.S. quickly endorsed that. I actually think they recently backed off that, though. I think they've kind of renounced their support for Guaido as the interim president, and they've backed this new plan for a transitional government, which was just last week, I think, or the week prior. So I think that also could play into this whole, it seems they're really cooking something up here. They've issued this indictment, they've gone on this new mission, and then they've also announced this new plan for a new transitional government. And so,
can I just jump in on that plan? Because I saw the way it was covered in the U.S. media was that it was a softening of the position where, for some reason, Maduro would agree to give up power and allow the Congress that is opposition controlled pit the new leader with the promise of elections in 6 to 12 months. And that, in that case, the U.S. would lift sanctions. It doesn't really seem like it's a softening of the position. It's a, Maduro must go position, and the opposition gets to pick a leader. And so, yeah, I guess it is somewhat a back off a little bit of the, Juan Guaido is just president. It is still going to be that the opposition that the U.S. is demanding take over. And so I guess it's not all that much different. It doesn't.
Right. I mean, it seems like more just a reworking of their plan. Like backing Guaido was not going to work. It doesn't seem like it was doing anything. I was also about to mention how the U.S. had backed this attempted insurrection I think it was just last April, almost exactly a year ago, where Guaido and another opposition guy, Leopoldo Lopez, they tried to get the military and security forces to defect. But that totally failed. And so, they had 2 or 3 days of protests and some street clashes, but it went nowhere and fizzled. And so it seems like maybe they're just trying to re-gear their plan here. They're trying to they're coming up with some other idea for how they can try to push Maduro out. And I think part of that involves this new plan for a transitional government. There's also, of course, sanctions on Venezuela. We're hitting its oil sector, which is vital to the way their system works. The oil revenues are vital to their government revenue and stuff. And all kinds of things we've tried to do to put pressure to kick Maduro out of power. But so far, nothing has worked. He's still there. Guaido doesn't seem like he's anywhere near, taking power. But now it does seem like they're stepping things up. They're creating this whole narrative that Maduro's a narco-terrorist, and they're now actually sending the military on a drug war mission there. And so those things, I think, are pretty clearly connected. Not to mention they singled out Maduro in Venezuela in the briefing where they announced this new mission. And I think Venezuela was the only country they'd actually singled out. And so this definitely does look like some kind of, major escalation against Maduro here. They're, all these new developments are kind of going in the same direction. I think Maduro is the second sitting head of state that the U.S. has ever indicted, actually. And the first one was Manuel Noriega, who I'm sure your listeners are familiar with. That was the president of Panama in the 1980s. And Manuel Noriega had actually worked with U.S. intelligence agencies for years. He helped them arm up militants and anti-communist guerrillas across Latin America. But then at some point we turned around and charged him with drug smuggling and money laundering and racketeering. Not too far off from what we've just charged Maduro with. However, in Noriega's case, after his indictment, we ended up invading Panama in 1989 and capturing him. And then we brought him to the U.S. to be tried, and we imprisoned him here for 20 years, 17 years or something. And so I certainly hope that's not the model that they have in mind for Venezuela. Venezuela is allied with Russia and China, so they have some pretty powerful friends. Their own military, I think, is quite a bit larger and more powerful than Panama's was in the 1980s. And so I would hope that they're not trying to do a sort of Noriega redux in this case with Maduro. But this new Navy mission does kind of look like it's sort of like the first step to something like that. Like, if they were going to do that, this might be what it looks like right in the first stage. However, I should say I've read some reporting that said that senior people at the Pentagon they're against this. Like, they're not happy with this idea at all of this new mission. And so I guess we just have to hope that some of those senior officials put up some resistance to this mission, and that it doesn't get too out of hand. And maybe part of their thinking too is the pandemic and the things that we've been talking about, that Navy vessels are particularly susceptible to outbreaks. You can't distance yourself. You have people sleeping, tons of people in one room. It's impossible to contain an outbreak. And so I hope some of those officials will sort of make sure this doesn't get too out of hand. But nonetheless, this is a pretty significant escalation against Venezuela.
Yeah, well, one part of it to me that seems just so ridiculous is how it doesn't match reality. First of all, it seems like a lot of drug smuggling exploits commerce. I guess that's the way to say it, to enter in through ports and stuff like that. And so the less travel and trade you have going on, I assume it is the harder to mask yourself and get across borders and get stuff into ports. And also with just the increased number of checkpoints and closed borders, we're going to talk about more U.S. forces at the southern border. It seems like, it would actually be the opposite, where this would be a time where it would be more difficult to traffic illegal narcotics. The second thing is that almost all of the illegal narcotics, especially, talking about the cocaine that comes from South America, ends up going up the Eastern Pacific coastline and not around through the Caribbean and through Venezuela. In fact, by the government's own numbers, only 7% of cocaine is trafficked through Venezuela. And I guess people could point to that, and they could probably find somewhere where, in a somewhat organized fashion, there's some, chunk of the Venezuelan government, some guy has his subset of a ministry, and they, work with some group in Venezuela because they make a hell of a lot of money trafficking drugs. But it seems far short of any kind of actual, coordinated effort by Maduro and the Venezuelan government to facilitate the drug trade through the Venezuelan state and then up into the noses of Americans, which is, of course, where this all generates is that demand.
Yeah. I mean, you would think that with the pandemic like this right now, where there's fewer people on the roads, there's fewer traffic, fewer people crossing the border, that this would be a particularly bad time to try to be smuggling drugs. You'd think that you'd want to blend into a big rush of people coming in and out of a country in order to smuggle. And like you said, there's checkpoints and stuff. The military, of course, just did their typical MO where they just say, we have indications that the cartels are plotting to exploit the pandemic and stuff, but they never cite any evidence for this at all. And it does seem to me like, I wasn't aware actually of how little of the cocaine was trafficked through Venezuela. But it does seem to me that this sort of drug war narrative here, I think it's sort of just cover for an operation against Venezuela, or it seems like that's pretty likely. So I think they're just trying to sort of, put this in the garb of a drug war mission. I'm not sure exactly how much drugs traffic through the Caribbean Sea exactly, but it does seem like they're just trying to find a way to get at Venezuela with this mission. And
I highly recommend an article by Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com on this. And, it's about the trafficking. It's not his most recent article. It's his second most recent, but definitely check that out. The last thing I want to mention here, Will, and I don't know if we have any actual info on this yet, but, what the Venezuelan response, because I would not be, if I were Maduro, and not that I would ever be a communist dictator, but if I was in Maduro's position right now and I'm looking practically at what to do, I think I have to at least be somewhat concerned that the U.S. may try to Noriega me. And so I have to, operate my military in a way that isn't centered around combating the coronavirus. Now, I'm not for, as a libertarian, deploying the military to combat the coronavirus. However, there are personnel and equipment within the military that would be useful and helpful in combating the coronavirus. So, there's doctors and surgeons and nurses in the military, and they own ventilators and stuff like that. And so it seems like if Maduro has to worry about some kind of invasion and has to, call up, troops to duty and put them on guard and on alert and all that, it's going to take resources away from, the civilian population of Venezuela. And on top of that, I'm guessing it's going to make, the spread of coronavirus among Venezuela's military more likely, as if you're preparing for military conditions that it's tight quarters, it's close operations. One of the things that I believe it's either Danny Sturgeon or Andrew Basovich talks about in their article this week is just whenever you're carrying out any kind of tactical training in the military, you can't keep 6 feet distance from each other, and so that it just seems like that's going to be a problem within Venezuela.
Yeah, I mean, Venezuela, too, remember, has they have a pretty severe economic crisis for a while now. So they're sort of vulnerable to some of these things. And we're talking about resources and how many resources will they devote toward, defending against a potential American invasion versus, combating the coronavirus versus, just trying to offset the economic crisis that's been going on for years. And, I think another possible, effect of this might be that it might, lead to greater crackdowns within Venezuela. If they're afraid they're about to be invaded and there's a pandemic there, that might lead to further militarization of their streets and stuff. So we might see something like that. At least it could be conducive to something like that. I don't know how likely that is to actually happen. But nonetheless, we are pushing Venezuela to we're pushing several crises on them all at once here. The sanctions are helping to really screw up their economy. And of course, their own economic policies, too. It's not just the sanctions, but, that plus the pandemic plus fear of being invaded, that might have some effects domestically within Venezuela in ways that we as libertarians would not really be fond of.
Right. And I would just imagine on the mental health and the psychology of Maduro. If somebody feels threatened and paranoid, my guess is they're going to be a far more dictatorial leader and far more aggressive. And so, it just doesn't seem like this is going to play out well for the Venezuelan people at all, who, again, are already really suffering under the U.S. sanctions campaign. Something that I, mentioned in all of that, Will, do you have anything else to add on Venezuela?
Oh, no. Oh, go ahead.
Okay.
No.
Yeah, I just I wanted to mention that more U.S. troops have been deployed to the southern border, and I know you have some details on that.
Yeah. They just the U.S.-Mexico border. They just sent another 540 soldiers to go back up the border patrol guys there, and they're joining another over 5,000 other soldiers who have already been deployed there. I think that's made up of 2,500 National Guardsmen and then another 2,700 active duty soldiers, just regular troops. And I think it would be the Army, but I'm not totally sure of all the branches that are involved with among the active duty guys. But part of the reasoning for this, for going and beefing up their presence there, is that the Border Patrol guys need more help, I guess, because of the pandemic. I guess it's more difficult to capture and detain illegal immigrants if you're worried they might have the virus. There's more personnel and stuff that has to go into that. That's, I think, their rationale. And the Border Patrol guys have actually just been granted some greater authorities too now. Because of the virus, where they're now able to capture migrants and then send them directly back across the border, immediately, instead of transferring them to one of these overcrowded holding facilities where, there've been quite a few issues. Even well before the coronavirus, there was some weird, mysterious illnesses going around in some of these holding facilities where a couple people had actually died and not gotten any treatment. And so we already know that those places are not good for, it's the sanitary situation there is not very good in these detainment facilities. And so this new rule is going to allow the Border Patrol guys to just send them right back into Mexico instead of detaining them. And the soldiers that are going to be coming to help them apparently are going to be running surveillance gear along the border. They're going to be doing administrative stuff. They're going to be running some food services, and then also apparently manning some of these detention centers that I just mentioned. And there've been National Guard and active duty soldiers near the border since 2018. And so this is not a brand new phenomenon by any means. Like I said, there was already 5,200, I think, soldiers there already. But they're now just beefing up the military presence at the border because of the health crisis. And the administration was actually considering for a while sending up to 1,000 soldiers to the border with Canada as well. But they eventually ended up deciding against it. Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, was not happy with that idea. He said it would be a mistake. He said there was no good reason to militarize the U.S.-Canada border, and that if we did, it would harm our relationship as countries. And so I guess, I'm not sure if his opposition was the only factor that made the U.S. decide against it, but the Trump administration said they won't be sending troops to the U.S.-Canada border. But it does seem they are trying to militarize. They're using this coronavirus thing to militarize the borders further than they already were.
Right. Well, and we did, at least up until recently, have military doctrine in the U.S. that said U.S. troops weren't supposed to enforce law within the United States, but immigration law is law, and it seems like they're enforcing that. So, what do you remember the Latin name of that?
Oh yeah, posse comitatus. The
right. Yeah. And so I guess that's just being ignored here. We're going to, continue in just another way where the federal government has been able to, do broad executive moves with little to no consideration for not only the long-term consequences, but what, the rules of the game for government are and what the Constitution says.
Yeah, and I mean, with the borders too, you've had the government has used the borders as an excuse to erode rights before too. I'm sure you're familiar with the 100-mile, I think it was, Constitution-free zone. Basically, that's some amount of miles inland from all the borders of the United States, where the rules for searching people's possessions and stuff, there's relaxed rules about what the border patrol guys can do if they claim they're on a mission that's related to border control. And so now that's sort of now intersecting. The border issue is now intersecting with the pandemic issue. And yeah, they're going to use this, as you're saying, to erode posse comitatus. And, who knows what other kind of things they're going to use these things to erode. The Department of Justice was just recently talking about suspending the right of habeas corpus for the duration of this pandemic and being allowed to hold people indefinitely here in the U.S., not in Guantanamo Bay or anything. So, it is sort of worrying the things that they're using the things that they're justifying using this crisis.
Yeah, that 100-mile Constitution zone is just so crazy. I've spent the last several years of my life living in New England. And so that 100-mile zone around the border, the way the map kind of works for New England, makes, I believe, all, if not almost all of New England a Constitution-free zone. It's quite crazy to look at how that map plays out. But I do want to move on here, Will, and ask you next about, I don't want to say good news about the coronavirus, but one of the things that I think has happened for some people with coronavirus is almost like if an alien race came to Earth, there's an enemy that's non-human. And so there's a kind of a sense for human beings across the world that, we're uniting against the common enemy. And I think that, triggers a little bit of, that tribal sense. And it's being used very positively, and I'm seeing calls for a global ceasefire. And while I don't want to be naive, I do think this is an important story to cover. So go ahead and let us know what's happening here.
Yeah. So we were just talking about sort of some of the ways that people in power are trying to exploit this crisis for bad things. But this is one of the silver linings, I guess. I guess you're right. It's not good news, but it is one of the silver linings among this whole pandemic, is that the United Nations, their Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has been calling for this global ceasefire. And I think he first made that call in late March. And of course, because of the virus, he's saying that the whole world has to unite to fight. I think you even used the exact words that he did, a common enemy. And that, armed conflict in any country right now is basically making the situation worse in every possible way. Trying to fight a pandemic as well as a war is just not that's a disastrous scenario. And the Secretary General of the UN has said that 70 UN member states have now endorsed this idea. So, we do have quite a few countries saying that they're glad to see that happen. Of course, not all 70 of those countries are actively involved in a conflict. So, some of those, they're not really players who can make that decision. But 11 countries have apparently signed on where there are conflicts going on. And I think some of those countries, they're sort of defining it a bit broadly, like in the Philippines, I think there's some anti-ISIS operations going on there, but I don't think there's an active full-blown war happening. But nonetheless, the 11 countries that he listed were the Cameroon, the Central African Republic, Colombia, Libya, the Philippines, Myanmar, Sudan and South Sudan, Syria, Yemen, and Ukraine. And so these are all 11 countries that in some way have signaled that they're willing to sign on to this global ceasefire where there's actually some level of fighting going. So, So, that's certainly promising. I'm not sure how many, just how committed all of these governments are to this idea. And to be honest, some of the conflicts I'm not really too informed about. Like in the Central African Republic, I'm not totally aware of like what the situation is there with the conflict there. But nonetheless, these 11 countries have said that they want to do this. I know in Yemen, both the Houthis, the rebels, or Ansar Allah they call themselves, and the Saudis have agreed to the ceasefire. I've seen one of the top Houthi guys on Twitter saying that he's very happy to see that happen, and then I know that the spokesman for the Saudi coalition, Al Malki, has said that he's down with it too, that he's glad to see this happen. Unfortunately, they've kind of had a hard time getting it started in Yemen. The fighting hasn't stopped there. Like I just saw, I think just yesterday, there was a report, their Houthis were saying that they chased away a formation of Saudi warplanes flying over Yemen with a surface-to-air missile. And so they're definitely still shooting at each other over there. But they've both parties to that conflict have agreed that they would like to sign up.
Within the past week, the Houthis fired a couple of ballistic missiles into Saudi Arabia that the Saudis say were shot down, although a couple people were injured by the falling debris. And then the Saudis carried out heavy airstrikes against the Yemeni capital, Sana'a. And while it was reported that one civilian was killed in these several airstrikes that hit the presidential palace school, a military facility that housed horses was actually hit with a cluster bomb, and it killed 70 horses and injured several others.
Yeah, so clearly in Yemen, they have not quite, put this into practice. They haven't even gotten close. They're still just, fighting as ever. But I guess it is promising to hear them. I mean, I think the Houthis and the Saudis have said before that they would like to reduce or scale back fighting or to have a ceasefire or something. But, maybe, if we're being optimistic, maybe this pandemic thing and this call from the UN will, make it more likely this time around. But at the very least, they've said they'd like to do it. And similar to Yemen, there's also still fighting going on in Libya. That was another country on the list. But apparently the two major parties there of that conflict, the Government of National Accord based in Tripoli, the one backed by the UN, and then the Libyan National Army led by General Khalifa Haftar, both of them have also said that they would be glad to do this global ceasefire. But again, I'm not really sure how committed they are because they have also, spoken about wanting to do ceasefires before, and they've not been able to figure that out. They're still fighting. So again, maybe similar to like Yemen, maybe this will give them some further impetus to get it together and try to come to some ceasefire to at least reduce the fighting there. There was also Syria was on Guterres' list, and where there actually is right now a ceasefire in place over Idlib, the Idlib province, as we've covered a lot on the show, where just a few months ago, Turkey and Russia and Syria had nearly gotten into a pretty significant conflict. There were quite a few soldiers on both sides killed. But they were able to come to some kind of de-escalation agreement, which Guterres actually says is still holding. And so, that's a good sign that, I think the worst fighting in Syria was in Idlib at this point. And so having a ceasefire there basically, entails that most of the fighting there is being limited at least. I know there's some military operations still going on outside of Idlib, but I think the worst stuff there was happening in that province. And so Syria, they're actually apparently they've agreed to this, according to the UN Secretary General, and there's already sort of some precedent for a ceasefire there in Syria. So I think that's also pretty promising to see. But so I don't know, some of these countries, they've agreed to do this, but they're not, they haven't quite signed on yet. But nonetheless, it's a good sign. I think I've said that a few times. My bad. However, what I meant to get to was the UN also has called for lifting all sanctions worldwide on all countries. So in addition to the ceasefire idea, they're also calling for all economic war to sort of be halted. And they're saying, some of these really heavily sanctioned countries like Iran are fighting their own big outbreaks with the coronavirus. And it's making it way harder with, significant sanctions on their economies. And in addition to Iran, the UN singled out Cuba, North Korea, Venezuela, and Zimbabwe as countries that we should lift sanctions on. That sanctions in general should be lifted. They didn't actually mention the U.S. by name, but all of those countries they listed are countries that are being sanctioned by the U.S. And so they kind of, I guess, just glancingly referred to us, they didn't say directly U.S. stop, sanctioning these countries, but kind of they did. And the U.S. actually just, we've been extending sanctions on Iran recently. We've slapped more on them. And then just in March, we've also extended sanctions on Zimbabwe, too, one of the countries that the UN had called us to lift sanctions from. I think they were one of the more recent ones that we've sanctioned, just a few days ago. And in Zimbabwe, where there's like 86 officials and 56 companies there that are linked to the ruling party that we have penalties on. And actually, just a few months ago, it's kind of ironic the UN is now calling for us to remove sanctions from Zimbabwe because the UN special reporter on the right to food had actually just recommended that the US and the EU slap more sanctions on them just in like December. And so, and of course, these sanctions are because of like abuses by the government and lack of press freedom and stuff like that, lack of democratic institutions and, the typical things that the U.S. will sanction countries for. But it's kind of ironic, though, that the UN is now saying, yeah, like take your sanctions off Zimbabwe, when just like, a couple months ago they were saying, calling for the U.S. and EU to slap more on them. And so I think those existing sanctions on that country just like bar some of the sanctioned people from coming to the U.S. and bar Americans from doing business with them. But I think some of the sanctioned companies in Zimbabwe are farms. And so that could have certainly some impact on the country beyond just a few elites. And of course, in Iran, the sanctions are really hurting the economy, really reducing their oil exports, which is like, kind of like Venezuela. Their system relies on that revenue to like finance all their government programs and stuff. And so it is having a pretty serious impact. But either way, regardless if the ceasefire idea or the lifting of all sanctions, regardless if that pans out in practice, I still think this is a commendable effort from Guterres and the UN. Somebody has to be saying this right now, and I'm glad that he's at least making the effort at it.
Right. Not a huge fan of, UN efforts, but anytime anybody's calling for peace, that's something we can sign on to. In relation to this, Will, I don't know if you caught that a Russian plane delivered some, different medical supplies like ventilators and masks to the United States. But there were a couple interesting parts of this story that I wanted to mention. The first was, especially the left half of the mainstream media reacted in. I'm not even joking. So after panicking about not having enough ventilators and hospital equipment for the past month, the headline in a propaganda win, Russia delivers medical equipment to the United States, which is just confusing. Why just want to be grateful to have the equipment and have to smear and begrudge this act that was bringing desperately needed medical equipment into the United States. But even more interesting, the company that they got this from was under U.S. sanctions. And so it seems that if we want to, we could ignore sanctions. And sometimes sanctions obviously here get in the way of putting medical supplies where they're most needed. And so that means just like the U.S. ignored this one, everybody should just stop ignoring U.S. sanctions. How great would that be?
Right. Yeah. I mean, especially during this whole pandemic, think like that, that was one case where our sanctions could have somehow, come back to really bite us. And yes, I did see the ridiculous coverage of the Russian aid, the plane shipment. It was a pretty big, there was images of inside of the plane. There was a lot of stuff in there, like a lot of equipment and supplies that is desperately needed right now, especially personal protective gear and stuff like that. But I just, just imagine, I'd seen, I think the Washington Post had, in one of their sub headlines or something about sure to give Russia a geopolitical edge over the West. It's like, imagine if Switzerland or something had brought aid. Imagine if that was you would never see coverage like that in a move sure to give Switzerland an edge over the rest of Europe or over the rest of the Western world. What a ridiculous, and also just perverse and gross way to be about aid. Like you said, they've been very, panicky and hysterical about, and maybe to some degree justified about these people, thousands of people suffocating to death in New York from, not having ventilators and, just not having adequate treatments, partially just because this virus, there aren't a lot of adequate treatments for it, but also because there's shortages and the hospitals are overwhelmed and stuff. But yeah, imagine reacting this way, when all of that's happening to be so ungrateful about aid. Now, the same thing happened in Italy, too, where there was a newspaper out there, La Stampa, had, gotten some anonymous source to say, oh, all the Russian aid was useless and they just sent their military here, as if it's some kind of prelude to an invasion or something, that, oh, they're driving military vehicles down our streets. And yes, they did send some military epidemiologists and stuff there and some disinfecting crews and stuff like that. But they also sent quite a few ventilators, which is right now the most needed thing pretty much everywhere. This is what has the worst shortages in a lot of different countries. And so Russia did send some of those vitally needed ventilators. And in Italy, you saw a similar reaction from sort of the, pro-NATO Atlantic Council kind of think tanky people. slamming it as a propaganda win. And the same thing goes for China, too. China's also delivered quite a bit of aid. The Chinese billionaire Jack Ma has been like lavishing like dozens of countries with tons of ventilators and masks and stuff. And I think in coordination with Beijing, with the Chinese government. And they've also gotten a similar treatment that like, oh, it's just a propaganda win, which it's, again, just a perverse, gross reaction to people getting life-saving aid.
Yeah, I was actually reading that some of that aid that either to Venezuela or Cuba, he was having trouble because the shipping company refused because of the U.S. sanction, and then you have a hard time landing another country because nobody wants to run afoul of U.S. sanctions and get hit with secondary sanctions.
Yeah. I mean, it's just like this is such an obstacle in front of trying to facilitate this aid where these countries really do need it. So it's yet another reason for why, the UN is correct to call for the lifting of sanctions during this health crisis, between actual armed conflicts and then economic, war and the barriers that puts in front of, even travel and moving goods from point A to B. Like it complicates an already very complicated situation.
All right. Well, before we wrap up here, I just want to ask you kind of, anecdotally, what's going on with you, within this coronavirus lockdown. I think as far as it goes for me, I'm still in the stage of just, trying to take precautions, and I'm working from home. So, it's very easy to just, kind of take it easy and be safe. And I'm not, having my life too interrupted by the coronavirus, fortunately. But I know in the past week we had over 1 million recorded cases, ever actually that represents, and 50,000 deaths. Again, lots of questions around those numbers. And I think, at least for me, I could get into that later, but just let the audience know kind of like what's going on there. You read stories online, and people in some parts of the country are saying the hospitals are absolutely, deserted, and hospitals are actually telling nurses not to come in. And then you hear New York City, which sounds like a situation that you would have found 2 weeks ago in Idlib, Syria, where they have tents outside of the hospitals to triage, the level of sickness. So how are things where you are? What's the level of crackdown? Has anybody called the cops on you for taking your dog for a walk yet? Tell us the details here.
Yeah, Michigan. I live in southeastern Michigan, like not too far from Detroit. And Michigan is now like the third worst hit state in the whole country. So I think we have like a little over 15,000 cases here. Which is still not quite as bad as New Jersey and New York. They have New Jersey has over double what we have, and New York has almost 10 times what we have. But nonetheless, we are in number 3 now, and there's a pretty significant outbreak in Detroit, in Wayne County, which is just like 2 counties over from me. We're under a statewide lockdown right now, or a stay-at-home order, but it's not being. I think in a lot of places it's really not being enforced very strictly. Like I don't think I'm about to get pulled over for driving around right now. But like you, I have personally just been trying to, lay low. And I also work 100% remotely. So my job has not been affected. My father, he has been furloughed at work for a couple weeks where they're like temporarily having a skeleton crew run the shop. So this has affected me to some extent. My sister she actually had to get another job because the restaurant she worked at is now only doing carry out. And so, this is sort of, affecting my family in some ways, the lockdown measures and the shuttering of businesses and things like that. But I have not seen too much reporting on really vastly overwhelmed hospitals in Detroit. I've seen some warnings that it could get to that point at some point soon. And I know they've set up a lot of testing centers and, tents outside of hospitals and stuff to test people. And so it is sort of getting to that point, but I don't think we're anywhere near like New York, where they're really direly warning of this outbreak, that it's vastly growing there. But worldwide with this outbreak, it does seem that we've not yet hit the peak. Like if you look at the daily increases, and again, I should qualify this. I'm not an epidemiologist. I can't say that with any expertise. I'm just saying if you look at the graph and see the daily number of new cases, it's still going up. We've not yet, hit the point where it's starting to fall. Now, I think places like Italy, it has started to drop down. Italy has had the worst death toll, at least. We've now surpassed them by far in cases, but they still have the worst, the greatest number of fatalities, and also the greatest death rate. Out of the number of confirmed patients, more people are dying out there, and a lot of that has to do with not enough ventilators and stuff. But yeah, so in the Italy is starting to taper off, but in the U.S., unfortunately, I think we're still on the we're on the upswing here. We're still we haven't yet reached the peak. We have I think 300,000 people infected here in the U.S., 335 or 337,000 out of the 1.2 million now in the world. So we are the top, in terms of confirmed cases, we are the top place. We have the most, the greatest number of outbreaks across the country. But yeah, I mean, I do tend to think that in Michigan, we're going to be seeing, continued lockdown. I don't think they canceled school for the rest of the year. So I don't see I don't really see them letting up on this anytime soon. I think, unlike some states, I know in Georgia, they imposed a lockdown and then a few days later opened up the beaches and stuff. My state seems to be taking it a little more seriously compared to some of the, other countries in the union or whatever. So, yeah, I mean, it's starting to get pretty bad here in southeastern Michigan, but it's, again, not nearly as bad as some other places in the country.
All right. Well, I'll have you back on next Monday, and stay safe till then, and tell people, in the upcoming week where they can keep up with your work.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a staff writer at RT. I work there 5 days a week. So I'm doing lots and lots of articles for them. And to find that stuff, you can go to my Twitter handle at WKP ANCAP. That's where I share all of my work. Also, Facebook, you can find me there, Will Porter. But I've also been published, as Kyle said at the beginning of the show, at the Libertarian Institute, Consortium News, The Daily Sheeple, and antiwar.com. It's that's where the bulk of my stuff that you can find it.
All right, Will. Thanks for coming on the show.
All right. Thanks, man.